In the small town of Springdale, a life hangs in the balance. Dr. Monica Tyler, one of Boston's most brilliant heart surgeons, receives an urgent call in the middle of the night, a desperate plea from Police Chief Robert Harris to save his 16-year-old daughter, Lily, who is fighting for her life. Determined to reach the hospital in time, Monica embarks on a tense, late-night drive, her mind racing with the weight of the challenge ahead. But what should have been a straightforward journey takes an unexpected turn when she is stopped by two local police officers. Their suspicion, prejudice, and refusal to listen create an agonizing delay, one that will have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. What unfolds in the aftermath is a story of loss, injustice, and unexpected courage. As the town grapples with the truth, alliances are tested, silence is broken, and change begins to take root. Will the weight of tragedy spark a path toward redemption and healing? The evening had settled over Boston like a heavy blanket. In her private practice, Dr. Monica Tyler leaned back in her leather chair, stretching her arms to ease the tension that had built up over 12 long hours of patient consultations. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound in the otherwise silent office. Outside, the city buzzed with life-distant car horns, the occasional chatter of pedestrians. Yet Monica felt isolated in her little corner of the world. She glanced at the clock on her desk. It read 10:42 p.m. The last patient had left hours ago, and Monica had stayed late to review charts and finalize notes. Her dedication to her work was both her strength and her burden. At 40 years old, Monica was at the pinnacle of her career. As one of the country's leading heart surgeons, her name was synonymous with precision and excellence. Hospitals across the nation had offered her positions with jaw-dropping salaries and accolades. Yet she chose to remain grounded. She had opened her private practice to make a personal difference. The sterile halls of big hospitals often felt impersonal, and Monica believed in treating each patient like a human being rather than a case file. Her office reflected her personality, organized and understated. A bookshelf lined with medical journals and textbooks stood against the wall, next to a family photo of her late mother and father. Monica kept their picture nearby as a reminder of where she came from, of the values instilled in her since childhood. Hard work, perseverance, compassion. The phone on her desk buzzed, breaking her thoughts. Monica frowned. At this hour, calls were rarely good news. She hesitated for a brief moment before picking up. "Dr. Tyler speaking?" she said, her voice professional but weary. A deep, urgent voice came through the line. "Dr. Tyler, this is Chief Robert Harris from Springdale." Monica sat up straighter. Chief, Springdale? It was a small town 2 states away, barely a dot on the map. "I am sorry to call you so late, but I do not know what else to do," the voice continued. "My daughter Lily, she is only 16, she has had a massive heart attack. The doctors here, they say they cannot save her." His voice cracked, thick with desperation. "They told me you are her only hope. Please, Dr. Tyler, I am begging you." Monica closed her eyes for a second, feeling the weight of the moment. A father's plea was not something she could ignore, especially when it involved the life of a child. Though she had never met Chief Harris or his family, Monica understood what it meant to hold someone's last hope. "Mr. Harris, I need more information," Monica replied, her voice steady. "What have the doctors done so far?" He explained quickly. Lily had been diagnosed with a severe congenital heart defect, a septal abnormality that caused irregular rhythms and poor blood flow. The local hospital lacked the expertise and resources to operate. Lily's heart was failing, and time was slipping away. "Send me her medical records immediately," Monica instructed. "I will leave tonight." A wave of relief washed over Harris's voice. "Thank you, Dr. Tyler. I will send everything right now. The hospital is Springdale Regional. I can have someone meet you at the entrance." "Understood," Monica said, ending the call. She felt her heartbeat quicken. There was no time to waste. In the next 20 minutes, Monica moved with urgency. She packed her surgical gear into a small black case, grabbed her laptop, and checked Lily's medical files as they came through. It was, as Harris had described, the condition was serious and complex. Without immediate intervention, Lily would not survive. Monica threw on her coat and rushed out to her car. Her SUV sat waiting in the cold night air. As she settled into the driver's seat and started the engine, Monica paused for a brief moment. Her reflection stared back at her in the rearview mirror. Sharp eyes, smooth brown skin, and a quiet determination etched across her face. "This is why you do this," she whispered to herself. "To save lives." She eased out of the parking lot and headed for the highway, the dark road stretching endlessly before her. The drive to Springdale was long, nearly 300 miles, about 5 hours under normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. Every minute counted. The highway was quiet at this hour, broken only by the occasional headlights of passing cars. Monica gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the road. The hum of the engine became her companion as her mind worked through the steps of the surgery. She replayed the procedure over and over, envisioning the tiny, delicate tools she would use, the way her hands would move with practiced confidence. But even as she focused on her craft, her thoughts drifted to the deeper pressures weighing on her shoulders. Monica had spent her entire career proving herself not as a surgeon, but as a black woman in a field where she was often underestimated. She thought back to medical school, when professors questioned her abilities. She remembered the skeptical glances from patients when she introduced herself as their doctor. "Are you sure you are qualified?" they would sometimes ask. She had worked twice as hard to silence the doubt, and over time, her skill had spoken for itself. Yet moments like these emergencies with life or death hanging in the balance reminded her why she fought so hard. Talent and kindness had no color. She was a surgeon, not a statistic. Monica's phone chimed with a message from Chief Harris. "Thank you again. I know you can save her." Monica's lips pressed into a firm line. "I will try," she whispered. The hours passed slowly. Outside her window, the dark landscape blurred by. She turned up the heater to ward off the chill creeping into the car, but nothing could quiet the growing tension in her chest. Every tick of the clock felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. Then, just as the lights of Springdale came into view, Monica saw the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car in her rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped. "No, not now," she muttered under her breath. The siren gave a short blare, signaling her to pull over. Monica swallowed hard and eased the car onto the shoulder. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel as she watched two police officers step out of their patrol car and approach her window. One was older, stocky, with sharp features and short gray hair. The other was younger, taller, but with uncertainty in his posture. Monica rolled down her window as the older officer stopped beside her. "License and registration," he barked, his voice cold and suspicious. Monica complied, handing over her papers. "Officer, I do not believe I was speeding. I am a doctor on my way to Springdale Regional Hospital. There is an emergency." The officer narrowed his eyes. "Where are you coming from? And why are you driving so fast this late at night?" "I am Dr. Monica Tyler, from Boston," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Chief Robert Harris called me to perform surgery on his daughter. She is dying, and I do not have time to waste." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but the older one let out a humorless chuckle. "Chief Harris, huh? You expect me to believe that?" Monica's heart pounded. She looked at the clock on her dashboard. Every second they delayed her, Lily's life slipped further away. "Call him," she said, her voice tight. "If you do not believe me, call him now." The officer smirked, his hand resting near his belt. "Not so fast, lady." A shiver ran down Monica's spine. She realized then that the challenge ahead was not only in the operating room, but also here, on this empty road. Monica's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The cold night air blew through the crack of her window as the officer's skeptical gaze bore into her. He didn't move, his stance rigid and unyielding, as though he had already made up his mind about her. "Officer, please," Monica said again, her voice firm but even. "Call Chief Harris. He can verify everything." The older officer, whose name tag read Fisher, let out a dismissive scoff. "At 2 in the morning? And wake up the chief? I don't think so." From behind Fisher, the younger officer Newton shifted uncomfortably. His hands were tucked awkwardly into his belt, his posture less combative, as if part of him wanted to speak up. Monica caught his eyes for just a second, searching for a glimmer of understanding. There was hesitation in his expression, uncertainty, but he quickly looked away. Monica took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had faced this type of situation before. As a black woman, she had learned to navigate spaces where her very presence drew suspicion. Still, tonight, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. A young girl's life hung in the balance, and this delay was stealing precious time. "Sir," she said, choosing her words carefully, "I am not lying to you. I am a surgeon, and a young girl in your town is dying as we speak. I am her last chance. I do not have time for this." Fisher raised an eyebrow and leaned closer to her window. His voice was low and sharp. "You talk like you're giving orders. You don't tell me what to do. I decide how this goes." The insinuation in his tone stung, but Monica refused to let it show. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was now 2:17 a.m. She felt the seconds tick by, like a physical weight pressing on her chest. If she didn't get back on the road soon, it might be too late. "Please," she said again, her voice softening. "Call the chief. If I'm wrong, then I'll answer for it." Fisher tilted his head as if considering her words, but instead, he turned back to Officer Newton. "Search the car." Monica's pulse spiked. "What? Why?" Fisher's smirk was slow and deliberate. "We see a woman driving fast out of town, with a story that doesn't add up. It's our job to investigate." Officer Newton hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Grant, I don't know if we need to—" "Do it," Fisher snapped, cutting him off. Newton froze for a moment, but then slowly stepped forward. Monica's stomach churned as she realized the gravity of the situation. Every second they wasted was another second that pushed Lily closer to death. She couldn't let this happen. "Enough," she said suddenly, her voice louder than she intended. Both officers paused, turning toward her. "You think I am lying?" Monica demanded, her calm facade cracking under the weight of frustration and fear. "Then call him. Right now." Fisher's expression darkened at her tone, his hand drifting to his belt in a gesture of dominance. "You need to watch yourself." Before the moment could escalate further, headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. The light grew brighter, and a car slowed to a stop a few yards behind Monica's SUV. She turned her head, squinting into the glare. A man stepped out of the vehicle, his hands raised in an unthreatening manner. "Everything all right here, officers?" the man called, his voice clear and steady. Fisher straightened, visibly annoyed. "Move along, sir. This doesn't concern you." The man ignored him and approached cautiously. Monica watched him warily as he neared. He looked to be in his late 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes that squinted slightly in concern. He wore jeans and a heavy coat, as though he had just thrown it on to rush outside. "Hi," he said, speaking directly to Monica now. "Are you all right?" Monica blinked, momentarily stunned by his interruption. "I know I am not all right. I am a doctor on my way to Springdale Hospital to save a young girl's life. These officers will not let me go." The man turned to Fisher, his voice calm but authoritative. "Is that true? Is this woman telling you she's a doctor?" Fisher's jaw tightened. "That's her story, but we have reason to—" "Call Chief Harris," the man interrupted firmly. "Who are you?" Fisher demanded, his tone defensive. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. "Ethan Thompson. I know the chief personally. Call him now, or I will." Newton and Fisher exchanged a glance, but Ethan's confidence left them with little room to argue. Fisher let out an irritated grunt before pulling out his radio. "Dispatch, connect me to Chief Harris," he muttered. The line crackled as dispatch responded, and within moments, Chief Robert Harris's voice came through the radio, sharp and unmistakably awake. "Fisher, why are you calling me at this hour?" "Sir," Fisher said, clearly uncomfortable, "we have a woman here claiming to be a doctor you called." Chief Harris's voice boomed through the radio, laced with anger. "You stopped Dr. Monica Tyler. Are you out of your mind? Let her go immediately. If you cost me another second, I will have both your badges." Fisher's face went pale. Newton visibly flinched at the chief's tone. Without another word, Fisher handed Monica her license and registration. "You're free to go," he muttered, his voice low. Monica snatched the papers from his hand, anger bubbling in her chest. She didn't say a word to the officers as she started her engine, but before she could drive off, Ethan Thompson stepped to her window. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you okay to drive?" Monica nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, thank you." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "Get to the hospital safe. I'll follow behind just in case." Monica hesitated, feeling a wave of unexpected gratitude wash over her. "Thank you," she whispered again. Ethan nodded and stepped back, letting her go. Monica pressed her foot to the gas pedal, her SUV speeding back onto the empty road. The flashing lights disappeared in her rearview mirror, but the anger and disbelief remained. Her hands trembled slightly on the wheel as the realization sank in. Those officers had delayed her for no reason other than prejudice. And yet, a stranger, someone she had never met, had intervened with kindness when she needed it most. Monica focused on the road ahead, the lights of Springdale growing closer with each passing mile. Ethan Thompson's unexpected help lingered in her mind. It reminded her of something her father used to say when she was young. "Even in the darkest places, there's always someone willing to light the way." As she sped toward the hospital, her determination solidified. She would not let Lily down. Not now. Not after everything. The road stretched endlessly ahead of her, but this time, Monica's hope burned brighter. The glow of Springdale's hospital lights emerged like a beacon on the horizon as Monica's SUV sped through the empty streets. She gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white from tension. Her heart pounded in her chest, every tick of the dashboard clocks a cruel reminder of the time she had lost. Lily Harris's life depended on her, and yet, for far too long, she had been held back by ignorance and suspicion. Monica shook her head, trying to push the anger aside. There was no time to dwell on what had happened. She swerved into the hospital's driveway, the tires skidding slightly on the asphalt. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the automatic glass doors of the emergency entrance. Monica threw the car into park, grabbed her black medical bag from the passenger seat, and rushed inside. The ER was brighter than she expected, but unnervingly quiet. Nurses and doctors moved quickly and efficiently, their voices hushed. Chief Robert Harris was easy to spot. He was pacing near the nurses' station, his large frame dwarfed by the weight of his grief. The lines on his face were deeper than they had sounded on the phone. His shoulders slumped under invisible burdens. "Chief Harris?" Monica called out as she approached, her heels clicking loudly against the linoleum floor. He turned immediately, relief flickering briefly in his bloodshot eyes. "Dr. Tyler!" He rushed toward her, his voice hoarse. Thank you for coming." Monica nodded, her movements brisk and purposeful. "Where is Lily? Take me to her." Without another word, Chief Harris led her through the emergency room, past beds where patients lay half-conscious and monitors beeped rhythmically. They rounded a corner and entered a small, brightly lit room where a team of doctors and nurses surrounded Lily Harris. Monica's eyes went straight to the young girl on the hospital bed. Lily was small, almost fragile-looking, her pale face a sharp contrast against the stark white sheets. Her chest barely rose and fell, and her thin arms lay limp at her sides. The machines beside her blinked frantically, sending out piercing alarms that rattled through the room. One of the doctors, a tired-looking man with graying hair, stepped forward. "You must be Dr. Tyler," he said quickly. "I'm Dr. Adams. We've been trying to stabilize her. But her heart—" He shook his head, his voice heavy with defeat. Monica moved to the bed without another word, her gaze scanning Lily's vitals. The numbers on the monitors were grim, her heart rate was erratic, her oxygen levels dropping dangerously low. The faint flutter of her pulse was a whisper of a heartbeat, one that threatened to disappear at any moment. "She's slipping," Dr. Adams said softly. "We were waiting for you to get here before attempting anything further." Monica pulled on a pair of gloves, her movements automatic and steady. "Prep her for surgery," she ordered firmly, glancing at the nurse beside her. "I'll need the operating room ready in 5 minutes." The nurse nodded and rushed out of the room. Chief Harris remained rooted in place, his eyes locked on his daughter. Monica turned to him, her tone gentler now. "Chief Harris, I will do everything I can to save her. I need you to trust me." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he fought to keep his composure. "I trust you, Dr. Tyler. Please just bring her back to me." Monica offered him a small nod before turning her attention back to Lily. She watched the girl's chest rise faintly, the rhythm uneven. For a moment she saw herself in Lily young, vulnerable, with so much life left to live. "Hold on, Lily. Just hold on." Minutes later, Monica was in the operating room. Lily prepped on the table before her. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the bright lights above cast a sharp glare on the metal instruments laid out beside her. Monica adjusted her mask, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle over her. This was where she belonged here, in this room, where her hands could make the difference between life and death. As the surgical team moved into position, Monica's mind became razor-sharp. "Scalpel," she said, extending her hand. The nurse handed it to her, and Monica's steady hands began their work. The room fell silent, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hum of machinery. Every incision was precise, every movement calculated. Monica's hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed this surgery countless times before. But in the back of her mind, the clock ticked loudly. Minutes turned to hours as Monica worked. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she ignored it, focused only on the delicate procedure before her. At one point, Lily's vitals dipped suddenly, and a nurse called out, her voice tense, heart rate dropping. Monica's pulse quickened, but she didn't falter. "Stay with me, Lily," she murmured under her breath as her hands moved with practiced precision. "Come on." The team worked together in perfect rhythm, responding to Monica's commands without hesitation. For a moment, there was a flicker of hope. Lily's pulse stabilized, the numbers on the monitors inching back towards safer levels. But the reprieve was brief. Suddenly, the monitors began to scream again. "She's crashing!" someone shouted. Monica's heart sank as she looked at the monitor. The flat line that stretched across the screen sent a cold chill down her spine. She grabbed the defibrillator paddles and called out, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Charge to 200. The nurse nodded, and the machine whined as it charged. Monica pressed the paddles against Lily's chest. "Clear!" The jolt coursed through Lily's body, but the monitor remained flat. Monica tried again. "Clear!" Nothing. Monica's eyes flickered to the clock on the wall. They had been fighting for almost 15 minutes. "Charge to 300, she said, her voice quiet now. "Dr. Tyler," Dr. Adams said softly, stepping closer. "Charge it," Monica said firmly. The machine whined again, and Monica pressed the paddles down one last time. "Clear!" The shock rippled through Lily's body, but the monitor remained silent. Flat. Final. Monica felt her chest tighten as the truth settled over the room. Slowly, she lowered the paddles and stepped back, her hands trembling. The nurses turned away, their faces etched with sadness. Dr. Adams lowered his head. Monica looked at Lily's still form, her small body dwarfed by the sterile hospital bed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Time of death, 3:27 a.m." The words felt like ash in her mouth. The room emptied quietly, leaving Monica alone with Lily. She pulled off her gloves and set them on the tray beside her, her movements slow and deliberate. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of failure. She had tried, she had fought, but she had been too late. Moments later, Chief Harris appeared in the doorway. He took one look at Monica's face and knew. His shoulders slumped, and he leaned heavily against the wall, as though his body could no longer hold him up. Monica stepped toward him, her voice soft and broken. "I'm so sorry." Chief Harris's face crumpled, and he buried his hands in his face, his body shaking with silent sobs. The sound of his grief filled the air, raw and heavy. Monica stood beside him, unable to find words that could heal such a loss. As she watched him, the guilt settled deep in her bones. She had fought with everything she had, but it had not been enough. And the delay, the precious time stolen from her on that dark road, clawed at her like a wound that would not close. Monica looked down at her hands, still steady despite her shaking heart. For the first time in a long time, they felt powerless. The quiet hum of Springdale Hospital's fluorescent lights echoed down the hallway, broken only by the faint sounds of a grieving father. Chief Robert Harris sat slumped in a plastic chair, his face buried in his hands. His sobs had quieted, replaced by the heavy stillness of someone who had crossed into a world of irreparable loss. Monica Tyler leaned against the wall a few feet away, her surgical scrubs wrinkled, her hair slightly undone from the hurried hours. She stared blankly at the scuffed linoleum tiles, her mind replaying the events in a torturous loop, the flat line on the monitor, her final desperate attempt to save Lily, and the crushing silence that followed. If I had gotten here earlier. The thought ran through her mind like a cruel whisper, over and over again. She had done everything she could. She knew this, but knowing it didn't soften the sharp sting of regret that now lived inside her. Monica inhaled slowly, gathering her resolve. She took a step forward, her shoes squeaking softly on the floor as she approached Chief Harris. "Mr. Harris," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. Robert Harris didn't move at first. His shoulders rose and fell with each shallow breath. After a long moment, he looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with tears. "She's gone," he said, his voice raw and hoarse, like the words physically hurt to say. Monica knelt in front of him, meeting his gaze. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Harris's eyes searched hers, and for a moment, Monica braced herself for blame. She had been late. She had been delayed. It didn't matter that the reasons were out of her control. She had still been too late. But Harris surprised her. Instead of anger, there was something else in his gaze, an unspoken understanding of what had happened. "They stopped you, didn't they?" he asked quietly. Monica hesitated, but the truth was too heavy to deny. "Yes," she said softly. "Two officers stopped me just outside of town. They delayed me for too long." Harris's fists clenched at his sides, the veins in his forearms bulging with restrained anger. "Who?" Monica shook her head. "I didn't get their names, but—" She paused, her brows furrowing. One of them, the younger one, seemed uncertain, like he knew it was wrong but didn't know how to stop it. Harris exhaled sharply, standing slowly from his chair. "You don't need to protect anyone, Dr. Tyler." His voice hardened, the grief giving way to something colder, more focused. "This isn't just about my daughter. What they did to you, what they always get away with ends now." Monica stood, carefully watching the chief as he straightened his shoulders. He looked older than he had just hours ago, as if Lily's death had etched new lines across his face. Yet there was also something else in his stance, an unwavering resolve. "Mr. Harris," Monica said gently, "you just lost your daughter. Maybe you should rest first." He turned to her, his eyes dark with conviction. "No, Dr. Tyler. I can't rest. Not now. If I let this go—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Then Lily's death means nothing." Monica didn't argue. She understood the weight of his words. For Harris, justice wasn't just about two officers or even himself. It was about his daughter's memory, about confronting a system that had failed them both. By sunrise, the news of Lily's death had begun to ripple through Springdale. Words spread quickly in small towns. People whispered in hushed tones in diners, churches, and grocery store aisles. The story of the out-of-town surgeon delayed by local officers was impossible to contain. Monica sat on the edge of the bed in the small guest room the hospital had arranged for her. Outside the window, the sky was streaked with soft shades of orange and pink. She should have been resting, but sleep refused to come. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her like a stone. The memory of the older officer, his disdainful smirk, his dismissive tone, lingered in her mind. "You think you can tell us what to do?" The words stung, but what hurt more was the powerlessness she had felt in that moment. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called quietly. The door creaked open, and Chief Harris stepped inside. He looked as though he hadn't slept either, but his demeanor was composed, purposeful. "Dr. Tyler," he said, his voice softer now, "I wanted to speak with you." Monica stood and gestured for him to sit, but he shook his head. "I won't stay long." He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "First, I need to thank you for coming. You didn't have to, but you did. And for that, I'll always be grateful." Monica nodded slightly. "I just wish I could have done more." "I know you did everything you could," Harris said firmly. "It's not your fault." Monica looked down at her hands, her voice quiet. "It doesn't feel that way." Harris stepped closer, his gaze steady. "That's because you care. People like you carry the weight of every life you can't save. But you also save so many. Don't let this take that away from you." His words settled over her like a balm, soothing a wound she hadn't realized was so deep. She looked up at him and nodded slowly. "Thank you, Chief." Harris straightened, his tone shifting. "I've already started the process of investigating the officers who stopped you. I know exactly who they are, Grant Fisher and Brad Newton." Monica blinked in surprise. "That quickly?" "This is my town," Harris said simply. "I know my officers. What will happen to them?" "That depends," he replied. "Newton, he's young, and from what you described, he hesitated. Maybe he can still learn. But Fisher—" Harris's expression darkened. "There's no excuse for his actions." Monica considered his words, then spoke carefully. "Mr. Harris, I'm not trying to excuse either of them. But the younger officer Newton, he looked like he didn't want to be part of it. Maybe he just—" She trailed off, choosing her words. "Maybe he just didn't know how to stand up to the man next to him." Harris frowned slightly, but nodded. "We'll see how this unfolds. But make no mistake, there will be accountability." He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "I'll need your statement, Dr. Tyler, the truth about what happened." "Of course," Monica said. "Anything you need." Harris nodded and left, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Monica sat back down on the edge of the bed, her mind swirling with thoughts. She had come to Springdale to save a life. She hadn't expected to find herself at the center of something much bigger. Her father's words echoed in her mind once more. Even in the darkest places, there's always someone willing to light the way. Perhaps Harris would be that light for this town, and perhaps, in some small way, Monica's presence could help ignite the change that Lily's death deserved. As the first rays of sunlight spilled into the room, Monica felt the faintest spark of hope. Springdale's early morning light cast long shadows across the town as Officer Brad Newton sat alone in his patrol car. He had parked at the edge of an empty lot just outside of town, where the cracked asphalt gave way to wild grass. The silence was deafening, save for the faint hum of the car's idling engine. Newton gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring blankly at the horizon. His thoughts circled like vultures, picking apart every moment from the night before. The woman in the SUV, Dr. Tyler. Her calm voice, the desperation in her eyes, the truth in her words. "We have every right to suspect you." Newton winced, Fisher's voice echoing in his head. He had stood there silent, complicit, while his partner humiliated her, delayed her, stopped her when she had been rushing to save someone's life. Now a young girl was dead, and he couldn't stop thinking about the look on Chief Harris's face as he walked into the hospital that morning, broken and grief-stricken. For years, Brad Newton had told himself he was one of the good guys. He had joined the force at 23, fresh out of community college, believing he could make a difference. Springdale was a small town, a quiet town. There had been no brutal crime waves or violent incidents to test him until last night, and he had failed. Newton closed his eyes and leaned back against the seat. He thought of Lily Harris, a girl he'd never met, but whose name he would never forget. Her life had ended while he stood beside Fisher and said nothing. His phone buzzed against the dashboard, and Newton glanced at it reluctantly. A text message from Fisher lit up the screen. "You keeping quiet about last night. Don't need you saying anything dumb to the chief." Newton's stomach twisted. Fisher's words felt more like a warning than a casual message. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, disgusted with himself, keeping quiet. It was what he had done for years, letting others lead, ignoring the wrongs he saw because it was easier than speaking up. But this time, it felt different. Dr. Monica Tyler sat across from Chief Robert Harris in his modest office at the Springdale Police Department. The room was neat but sparse old wooden furniture and a few framed photos of Harris with his family. One of the photos was of Lily, grinning in her cheerleading uniform, her arms thrown wide in a gesture of carefree joy. Monica's gaze lingered on the photo as Harris set down his pen. He had just finished taking her official statement about what had happened on the road. "That matches up with what I expected," Harris said, his voice rough but steady. "Thank you, Dr. Tyler." Monica nodded, clasping her hands in her lap. "What happens now?" "Newton and Fisher will be questioned," Harris replied firmly. "An official investigation will follow. I'll make sure of it." Monica searched his expression, seeing the exhaustion there, but also an unwavering determination. "Chief Harris, I want to say something about Officer Newton," she said carefully. Harris raised an eyebrow. "Newton?" "Yes." Monica leaned forward slightly, choosing her words. "When they stopped me last night, Newton didn't say much, but I could tell he knew it wasn't right. He hesitated." Harris frowned, considering her words. "That doesn't excuse him." "No, it doesn't," Monica agreed. "But hesitation means something. It means he knew better. Maybe he didn't have the courage to speak up then, but—" She paused. "Maybe he could still do the right thing now." Harris sat back in his chair, staring at her for a long moment. "You're a lot more forgiving than I would be," he said finally. Monica offered a small, sad smile. "I've learned that sometimes people need someone to believe they can change before they actually do." Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at the photo of Lily on his desk, his gaze softening. "We'll see," he said quietly. Newton sat alone in the locker room later that afternoon, his uniform shirt hanging loosely on his frame. The buzz of fluorescent lights overhead matched the static in his head. He had been summoned by Chief Harris for questioning, and the knowledge of it weighed on him like lead. Newton. The deep voice startled him. Newton looked up to see Chief Harris standing in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space. Harris's expression was unreadable, his eyes steady as they locked onto Newton. "Yes, sir," Newton said quickly, sitting up straighter. "Come with me," Harris said, motioning for him to follow. Newton rose from the bench, his heart hammering in his chest. The walk down the narrow hallway to Harris's office felt endless. With each step, his mind raced. Does he know everything? Will I lose my job? What am I going to say? When they reached the office, Harris gestured for Newton to sit in the same chair Monica had occupied earlier. The chief shut the door behind him and leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. "Newton," Harris said finally, his voice low, "I want you to tell me what happened last night. The truth." Newton swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Sir, I—" His words faltered, and he looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting nervously in his lap. "I know you were with Fisher," Harris continued, his tone sharper now. "And I know Dr. Tyler was delayed. Because of you, because of him, and because of nothing else but her appearance and the car she drove." Newton's face flushed with shame. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. "Why did you let it happen?" Harris pressed, his voice rising. Newton looked up then, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. "Because I was scared," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I didn't know how to stop it. I froze." Harris stared at him, his expression unreadable. "You froze?" "Yes, sir." Newton looked down again. "It wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right, but I—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Harris sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. The disappointment in his eyes was like a punch to Newton's gut. "You let Fisher humiliate a woman, a doctor, and you stood there and said nothing. Because you froze." Newton nodded miserably. "Yes, sir." Harris was silent for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "You know, Newton, I've been in this uniform long enough to know that silence is just as damaging as action." Newton looked up, shame etched across his face. "I know," he whispered. "I don't know how to make it right." Harris stared at him for a moment longer, then moved to sit behind his desk. "You start by telling the truth. To me, to the department, to yourself." Newton blinked in surprise. "The truth?" "Yes," Harris said firmly. "You tell the truth about what happened, about what Fisher did, about what you didn't do." Newton's heart pounded in his chest. Telling the truth would mean going against Fisher, the man he had worked beside for years. It would mean exposing himself as weak, complicit, and scared. But as he sat there, Newton realized something. The truth was the only way forward. Harris leaned forward, his eyes steady. "You can still do the right thing, Newton, but it's your choice." Newton sat in silence, Harris's words echoing in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll tell the truth, Chief." Harris's expression didn't soften, but there was a flicker of approval in his gaze. "Good." Newton rose from the chair, feeling lighter than he had in hours. For the first time, he wasn't running from what he had done. As he walked out of the office, Newton knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He would face backlash, questions, and maybe even the end of his career. But he also knew this: standing up now, no matter how late, was better than staying silent forever. Springdale's air seemed heavier that morning, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The news of Lily Harris's death and Dr. Monica Tyler's delayed arrival had started to ripple through the small community like a slow-moving storm. Whispers had begun to spread in cafes, at church gatherings, and around kitchen tables. At the center of it all was Chief Robert Harris, a man who had spent decades building trust and respect in Springdale. Today his office at the police department felt different, more charged, as though invisible cracks had begun to form in the walls around him. Officer Brad Newton sat in a wooden chair across from Chief Harris's desk, his back stiff, his hands clenching his knees as though he might unravel if he let go. He had spent most of the previous night wrestling with his guilt, his confession, and the knowledge that telling the truth could change everything for himself, for the department, and for Springdale. Chief Harris sat quietly for a long moment, studying Newton. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but firm. "I appreciate you coming to me, Brad. You told me the truth, and that counts for something." Newton looked down, his throat tight. "It doesn't change what happened." "No," Harris said, leaning back in his chair. "But admitting you were wrong, that's more than most people do." Newton glanced up, surprised by the chief's tone. He had expected nothing but anger and disappointment. Instead, there was something more layered in Harris's expression, a mix of sadness, resolve, and maybe even a sliver of hope. "Here's what's going to happen," Harris continued, folding his hands on the desk. "You'll give your official statement about what happened on that road. Everything. Your role, Fisher's role, and the truth about why Dr. Tyler was stopped." Newton swallowed hard but nodded. "Yes, sir." "And Fisher?" Newton asked quietly. Harris's eyes darkened. "I'll deal with him. He'll have a chance to answer for himself, but there will be consequences. This isn't just about Lily or Dr. Tyler anymore, Newton. This is about what's right." Newton exhaled shakily, feeling as though a heavy weight had been lifted from his chest. But with that relief came fear, the fear of backlash, of what his colleagues might say, of the uncomfortable spotlight that was sure to fall on him. "Chief," Newton said hesitantly, "what do I tell the others?" Harris's gaze hardened. "The truth. Nothing more. Nothing less." Newton nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought. "Now go," Harris said, motioning toward the door. "Get ready for what's coming." Newton stood, the tremble in his legs betraying his nerves, but he squared his shoulders. He owed it to Lily Harris. He owed it to himself. As he left the chief's office, the whispers that had been lingering at the edges of the department grew louder. Officers glanced his way, suspicion and curiosity etched on their faces. But Newton kept walking. Monica sat at a small table in the hospital cafeteria, staring down into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The exhaustion of the past 24 hours clung to her like a heavy cloak, but it was more than physical fatigue. It was the emotional weight of everything that had unfolded since she had first answered Chief Harris's call. Lily was gone. Despite everything Monica had done, despite the sleepless drive, the precision of her skills, and her desperate attempts to save the young girl, it hadn't been enough. And then there were the officers. Fisher's face still flashed in her mind, the smirk, the disbelief in his voice when she had said she was a doctor. It wasn't just his words that haunted her, but what they represented. She had seen it before, the unspoken barriers, the doubt that followed her into rooms where people expected to see someone else. But this time, it had cost something so much greater. Monica pushed the coffee cup away and rubbed her eyes, her fingertips pressing into her temples. For all her years of perseverance, of proving herself time and time again, there were still moments when the world reminded her that she would always have to fight harder, speak louder, and bear the weight of things that others never noticed. "Dr. Tyler?" Monica looked up to see Chief Harris approaching her table. His suit was wrinkled, his face shadowed by exhaustion, but he carried himself with the same quiet determination she had seen the night before. "Chief Harris," Monica said softly, straightening in her seat. "May I join you?" She nodded, and he sank into the chair across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat in the quiet hum of the cafeteria, two people tethered by loss, frustration, and a growing understanding of the road ahead. "I want you to know something," Harris said finally, his voice low but clear. "I spoke with Newton this morning. He admitted everything, how they stopped you, how Fisher led the whole thing. Monica's eyebrows lifted slightly. Newton told you that? Harris nodded. He froze. He didn't stop Fisher, but at least now he's owning up to it. Monica considered this, a flicker of surprise softening her expression. That's not easy to do. No, Harris agreed. But it's a start, and it means Fisher won't be able to hide behind silence. Monica watched him carefully. What will happen to them? There's going to be an investigation, Harris replied firmly. Fisher will answer for what he did. I don't care how long he's been on the force or who thinks he's untouchable. It stops here. Monica let out a slow breath, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and the sharp edge of lingering anger. I hope it makes a difference, she said quietly. It will, Harris said, his voice resolute, because I'm not going to let this go. Monica looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not just a grieving father, but a leader, a man willing to confront the hardest parts of his own community to create change. Thank you, Chief, Monica said sincerely. Harris shook his head. No, Dr. Tyler, thank you. You could have walked away from all this. Most people would. But you stayed. You gave us the truth. And now it's up to us to make it matter. Monica looked down at the table, her throat tight. She had spent so much of her life fighting battles alone, proving herself, defending herself, and picking herself up again. It was strange, in a way, to feel seen, to feel like someone else was carrying the fight alongside her. I think you'll make Lily proud, Monica said softly. Harris's expression flickered, grief flashing across his face before he swallowed it down. I hope so. The two sat in silence for a few more moments before Harris stood to leave. I'll keep you updated on what happens, he said. If you need anything before you head back to Boston, let me know. Monica nodded. I will. As he walked away, Monica sat back in her chair, feeling the faintest spark of hope settle in her chest. The road ahead would not be easy, she knew that, but there was something powerful in the way Chief Harris carried himself, in Newton's confession, and in the truth that was now beginning to surface. For the first time in days, Monica felt as though Lily's death might not be in vain. Even in the darkest places, there's always someone willing to light the way. The truth had a way of spreading like wildfire in small towns. By mid-morning, whispers of the investigation into Officers Fisher and Newton had made their way into nearly every corner of Springdale. Conversations that started in hushed tones at diners and grocery stores soon grew louder, tinged with disbelief, anger, and curiosity. Some townsfolk struggled to accept it. How could respect officers, men they had known for years, be accused of something so unjust? Others were less surprised. For them, this was a long overdue reckoning. By noon, Monica Tyler sat in the small guest room at the hospital, her laptop open in front of her. She had been debating whether to write something, an account of her experience, a way to ensure Lily's story was told. The events of the past 24 hours still felt raw, like an open wound, but something inside her knew that silence would only allow this to happen again, to someone else. She let her fingers hover over the keyboard for a moment before she began to type. The words flowed as she told the story, not just the medical urgency, but the unnecessary delay, the assumptions made about her because of her race and gender. She recounted the pain of having to beg for time that was already slipping away, and the courage of Chief Harris, who had chosen to confront his own department rather than allow the truth to remain buried. When she finished, Monica sat back, reading her words. They were not laced with anger, nor did they seek revenge. Instead, they were steady, clear, and hopeful. She had written the story as a plea for change, not just in Springdale, but everywhere. Monica hesitated for only a moment before she hit send. She forwarded the story to a trusted colleague at a Boston newspaper and closed the laptop with a soft click. The Springdale Police Department was unusually quiet that afternoon. Officers moved through the hallways cautiously, avoiding eye contact as they passed one another. Tension crackled in the air like an approaching storm. In the corner of the locker room, Officer Brad Newton sat on a bench, tying his boots. His fingers fumbled with the laces, his hands clammy. He could feel the stares from two other officers at the far end of the room. They were whispering, their voices low but unmistakably aimed at him. "You hear what he did?" one of them muttered. "Turning on his own partner," the other replied. "Unbelievable." Newton's shoulders tensed, but he didn't look up. He had known this would happen. Speaking the truth, no matter how necessary, always came with a price. He had expected Fisher's anger, but he hadn't fully prepared for the judgment of his colleagues. "Newton!" a voice barked. He looked up to see Fisher standing in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light. His face was flushed, his jaw set in a hard line. The two officers at the far end fell silent, watching intently as Fisher marched across the room. "You spoke to the chief," Fisher said, his voice low and dangerous. Newton swallowed, forcing himself to stand. "I told him the truth." Fisher scoffed, a humorless laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "The truth? You mean you threw me under the bus to save your own skin?" Newton's chest tightened. "You stopped her for no reason, Grant. You know that, and it cost a girl her life." Fisher took a step closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," Newton replied, his voice growing steadier. "And so do you." The two men stood face to face, the air thick with unspoken words. Newton could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, waiting to see what he would do. For a moment, he felt the old instinct to back down, to keep quiet. But then, he remembered Dr. Tyler's calm voice as she pleaded with them, and he remembered the look on Chief Harris's face as he spoke of Lily. Newton squared his shoulders, holding Fisher's glare. "You can hate me for it, but I'm not going to stay silent anymore." Fisher stared at him, his jaw working angrily. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, his boots echoing in the hallway. The silence that followed was deafening. Newton sat back down, his hands shaking slightly, but he felt something new, a faint sense of relief. For the first time in his career, he had chosen to stand up for what was right. Across town, Chief Robert Harris stood at the podium in a packed meeting room at City Hall. The room buzzed with anxious energy. Residents of Springdale filled the rows of folding chairs, their faces a mix of sadness, anger, and confusion. News of the investigation had reached everyone by now, and people had come to hear directly from the man who had ordered it. Harris adjusted the microphone. His broad shoulders stooped slightly, as though he carried the weight of the entire town on his back. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of people he had known for years, neighbors, friends, even fellow officers. "Thank you for coming today," he began, his voice deep and steady. "As many of you know, my daughter, Lily Harris, passed away early yesterday morning. She was 16 years old, full of life, full of dreams, and she is gone far too soon." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking into every corner. Harris took a deep breath, his voice growing firmer. "Lily's death was a tragedy, but what makes it worse is that it might have been prevented." A murmur spread through the crowd. "A doctor, Dr. Monica Tyler, was on her way here to save Lily's life," Harris continued, "but she was stopped, delayed, for no reason other than prejudice." The murmurs grew louder now, shifting to gasps of shock and disbelief. "I know this is difficult to hear," Harris said, his voice rising. "But the truth is often difficult, and I will not hide it from you. Two of my officers, men I trusted, chose to abuse their authority that night. One has admitted his role. The other will answer for it." The room erupted then, voices rising with questions and demands. Harris held up a hand, and the crowd gradually quieted. "I have served this town for over 20 years, Harris said, his voice unwavering. I have always tried to lead with integrity, to protect this community. But now, I must ask you all a hard question. What kind of community do we want to be? Do we want to ignore injustice when it happens right in front of us? Or do we want to face it, even when it is uncomfortable? The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Harris's gaze swept across the crowd. Lily deserved better. Dr. Tyler deserved better. We all deserve better. Change starts with honesty, and that is what I intend to bring to this department and this town. The days of looking the other way are over. A few people began to clap, tentative at first, but soon it spread until the entire room was applauding. Harris stepped back from the podium, his expression solemn but resolute. In the back of the room, Monica watched the scene unfold, her chest tight. For the first time since she had arrived in Springdale, she felt a sense of possibility. Change would not come easily, but it had begun. She turned and quietly slipped out of the room, her heart a little lighter than it had been before. The cold wind swept through Springdale's main street, rattling the signs of closed shops and pushing leaves into small spirals across the pavement. The town, usually quiet and predictable, now felt on edge, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. The meeting at City Hall had shaken Springdale to its core. The words of Chief Robert Harris lingered in the air like an aftershock. There was no turning back now. Too much had been said. Too much had been revealed. The fragile sense of harmony that blanketed the town had been torn open, exposing the uncomfortable truths beneath. For Monica Tyler, Springdale was no longer just a town she had driven through to save a life. It had become a place where she, too, was part of something bigger, a confrontation with injustice that couldn't be ignored. Monica sat on a bench outside the hospital, a thermos of coffee clutched between her gloved hands. The sky was overcast, the clouds swollen and gray. She watched the cars pass slowly on the street, people peering curiously at the building as if they could sense its significance in the story now gripping the town. Her phone buzzed on the bench beside her. She picked it up to see a message from her colleague in Boston. "Your story's live. It's spreading fast." Monica's chest tightened as she clicked on the link. There it was, her account of what had happened that night, laid bare for the world to read. The headline was simple but sharp: "Delayed Justice When Seconds Cost a Life." The article painted the full picture: Lily's critical condition, the desperate call from Chief Harris, Monica's late-night drive, and the officers who stopped her on the road. She had chosen her words carefully, not out of fear, but out of purpose. There was no bitterness, no sensationalism, just the truth. Monica scrolled through the article, seeing the growing number of comments. Some were supportive. "This breaks my heart. Things need to change." "Dr. Tyler is a hero. She still tried, even when the world worked against her." Others were angrier. "This isn't the first time this has happened, and it won't be the last unless we do something. Those officers need to pay for this. How can people defend this kind of behavior?" But inevitably, there were the dismissive comments too. "She's exaggerating. She's trying to stir trouble." What if they had a good reason? Maybe there's more to this story. Monica set the phone down, her chest hollow with a familiar ache. The pushback was expected. People rarely accepted ugly truths without resistance. Still, it hurt to see her intentions questioned, as though her very existence as a doctor, as a black woman, as a person, was something to doubt. "Dr. Tyler?" Monica looked up to see Chief Harris standing nearby, his coat pulled tight against the wind. He approached with slow, deliberate steps, his face lined with exhaustion. "Chief," she said, offering a faint smile as she gestured to the empty space on the bench. He lowered himself beside her, letting out a slow breath, as though the simple act of sitting down took effort. "I read your story," he said after a moment. Monica's fingers tightened around the thermos. "I hope it doesn't make things harder for you." "It won't," Harris replied, shaking his head. "It told the truth, The truth's already hard enough. They sat in silence for a moment, the wind tugging at their coats. Finally, Harris spoke again, his voice quieter now. The fallout's begun, Dr. Tyler. People are choosing sides. Some are with me. Others are angry, claiming I'm turning my back on my department. Does that surprise you? Monica asked gently. Harris sighed. No, but it's hard. I've spent years building trust here. Now, half the town sees me as a hero, and the other half thinks I've betrayed them. Monica studied him for a moment. You're doing the right thing, Chief Harris. People don't always see it right away, but they will. He looked at her, his eyes filled with something close to gratitude. It helps to hear you say that. Before Monica could reply, Harris's phone buzzed. He frowned as he glanced at the screen. It's about Fisher, he said, standing up. I have to go. Monica nodded. Take care, Chief. As he walked away, Monica sat back on the bench, the clouds above threatening rain. The storm in Springdale was just beginning. At the police department, Officer Grant Fisher sat alone in the interrogation room. The small space felt suffocating, too quiet, too stark. The walls were bare except for a small clock ticking loudly in the corner, counting every passing second. He stared at the table in front of him, his jaw clenched, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles were white. Fisher wasn't a man used to being questioned. He was the one who asked the questions, who held the authority, and yet here he was, waiting for his actions to be dissected by his own chief. The door opened, and Robert Harris stepped inside. He closed the door quietly, his calm composure a sharp contrast to Fisher's visible agitation. Harris took a seat across from him, setting a file folder on the table. Grant, Harris said evenly, I'm giving you a chance to explain yourself. Fisher scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Explain myself. For what? Doing my job? Harris's gaze didn't waver. Your job, stopping a doctor on her way to save my daughter's life. Delaying her? Mocking her? She was speeding, Fisher shot back defensively. It was suspicious. A black woman in a fancy car. What was I supposed to think? Harris's expression hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. What you were supposed to think, he said quietly, was that she was telling the truth. That she was a doctor. That you had no reason to stop her. What you did wasn't about the law. It was about prejudice. Fisher's face flushed red, his fists clenching on the table. This is ridiculous. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. Harris didn't raise his voice, but his tone carried the weight of every word. You will sit here, Grant, because you need to understand something. Your actions cost my daughter her life. You can make excuses. You can deflect. But that doesn't change what happened. Fisher's bravado faltered, his shoulders sinking slightly. He looked away, his jaw working silently as though he was trying to find a response. But there was nothing to say. Harris stood, his chair scraping against the floor. There will be consequences for what you did, he said firmly. This department will not protect you from the truth. He turned and walked to the door, leaving Fisher alone with the silence. That evening, Monica returned to her guest room, exhausted. The day had been long, filled with difficult conversations and heavy emotions. She sat at the small desk in the corner of the room, opening her laptop to see a flood of new messages and news alerts. Her article was still spreading. Some readers had begun sharing their own experiences, stories of prejudice, injustice, and the courage it took to confront them. Monica leaned back in her chair, a faint flicker of hope sparking in her chest. She had come to Springdale to save a life, and though she had failed in the operating room, something else had begun to take root, a movement, a demand for change. And maybe, just maybe, that was how Lily Harris's memory would live on. The crisp chill of early morning clung to Springdale like an uneasy silence. A faint fog hovered above the streets, as though the town itself was unsure of its next step. The events of the past few days, the meeting at City Hall, Chief Harris's public stand, and the revelations about Officers Fisher and Newton had cast a long shadow over everything, the kind of shadow that made people question the truth about their town and, perhaps, about themselves. For Monica Tyler, the weight of that truth was something she had carried her whole life. Now, she stood by her SUV in the hospital parking lot, her bags neatly packed in the back seat. She had decided to leave Springdale and return to Boston, to her patients, her practice, and the life she had worked so hard to build. But this small town, its pain and its promise, had carved out an unexpected space in her heart. She paused, taking in the view of the quiet hospital and the soft gray sky above. Springdale had become more than just another stop in her career. It had become a symbol of struggle, one she had seen time and time again, but it had also shown her something else, the faint glimmer of change. The sound of footsteps behind her drew her from her thoughts. Turning, Monica saw Chief Robert Harris walking toward her, his coat flapping slightly in the cold morning breeze. His face looked tired, the lines etched deeper than before, but there was something in his posture, a determination, an unspoken strength that made him seem taller. "Dr. Tyler," he said, offering her a small nod as he stopped beside the SUV. "Chief Harris," Monica replied, her voice warm but tinged with sadness. "I was just about to leave." Harris nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "I figured, but I wanted to see you before you went." Monica tilted her head slightly, waiting. Harris let out a breath, his shoulders sagging for a moment before he spoke. "I need to thank you, not just for coming here and trying to save Lily, but for staying, for speaking up when you could have walked away." Monica studied his face, her voice quiet. "I did what anyone should have done." Harris shook his head. "No, Dr. Tyler. What you did took courage. You showed this town what we didn't want to see, and I'm grateful for it, even if it's a hard truth to face." Monica glanced down, her heart heavy. "I just wish it had been enough to save her." Harris's expression softened. "You did everything you could. You gave her a chance, and you gave me the truth I needed to honor her memory." Monica looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "Do you think it will make a difference?" Harris's eyes darkened with conviction. "It already has." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Newton's official statement was finalized last night," he said, handing it to her. "He told the truth about everything what Fisher said, how he stood back, and how he failed to speak up." Monica took the paper carefully, her fingers brushing the edges. "What will happen now?" "Fisher has been suspended pending termination," Harris replied firmly. "Newton is facing disciplinary action, but I'm giving him a chance to prove himself. He knows what he did was wrong. He'll have to earn back trust." Monica raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You're giving him a second chance?" Harris nodded. "It's easy to condemn someone. It's harder to believe they can change. I think Newton can. Maybe I'm a fool for thinking that, but Lily would have wanted me to believe in second chances." Monica's chest tightened at the mention of Lily. "That's generous of you." "It's not about being generous," Harris said, his voice steady. "It's about building something better. A department, a town, where this doesn't happen again. Where people are held accountable, but also given a chance to grow." Monica felt something shift in her, a small, fragile spark of hope. "It sounds like you're already making that happen." Harris looked out over the hospital parking lot, his eyes distant. "Losing Lily." His voice faltered briefly before he continued. "It took something from me that I'll never get back. But if I let her death pass without change, then I've failed her. I won't let that happen, Dr. Tyler. I owe her that much." Monica looked at him, a deep respect settling over her. She saw not just a grieving father, but a man willing to fight through his own pain to build something better for his community. After a moment, Harris turned back to her, offering a faint smile. "You're leaving Springdale today, but I hope you know you've left a mark here." People are talking, listening. It's going to take time, but I believe this town can change." Monica smiled softly. "I believe that too." Harris extended his hand, and Monica shook it firmly. "Safe travels, Dr. Tyler, and thank you." "Take care of yourself, Chief Harris," she replied. Harris turned and walked back toward his car, leaving Monica standing by her SUV. She unfolded Newton's statement, scanning the neat handwriting that chronicled the events of that night, the hesitation, the regret, and finally, the truth. For Brad Newton, it was a small act of redemption, but Monica knew it wasn't small at all. He had chosen to do the right thing when it would have been easier to stay silent. It was a reminder that change didn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes, it came from ordinary people making brave choices. Later that afternoon, the streets of Springdale were no longer quiet. A small crowd had gathered in front of the police department, holding signs and speaking in low, determined voices. The town's younger residents had been the first to organize the peaceful gathering, using social media to rally support. Monica stood on the sidewalk across the street, watching from a distance. People held signs with messages like "Justice for Lily" and "Accountability for all." The sight made her chest tighten. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel the faint stirrings of pride. She spotted Ethan Thompson, her unexpected savior, on the road standing near the front of the group. He was talking to a few young people, his hands tucked into his coat pockets as he listened. When he noticed her watching, he raised a hand in greeting. Monica smiled and nodded back. Ethan's small act of kindness had changed everything that night, and now it seemed he was still lighting the way for others. "Ready to head home?" The voice startled her slightly, and Monica turned to see a nurse from the hospital, Clara, standing beside her. Clara had been one of the first people to welcome Monica after her arrival. "Yes," Monica said softly, glancing back at the crowd. "But it feels like something's just beginning here." Clara nodded, following Monica's gaze. "It is. Springdale's waking up thanks to you." Monica shook her head. "No, thanks to all of us." Clara smiled. "Safe travels, Dr. Tyler. You've done more than you know." Monica walked back to her car, the weight in her chest lighter now. As she drove out of Springdale, she couldn't help but think of her father's words once more. Even in the darkest places, there's always someone willing to light the way. Springdale had seen its darkness, but people like Chief Harris, Brad Newton, and Ethan Thompson had proven that light could still break through. And maybe, just maybe, that light would guide the town toward something better. The road stretched long and endless in front of Monica Tyler, the hum of her SUV filling the silence. Boston was still hours away, but her thoughts lingered on Springdale, on Chief Harris's resolve, Brad Newton's reluctant courage, and Ethan Thompson's quiet kindness. Each of them had played a role in breaking open a truth that was too often ignored. Outside her window, the horizon softened into pale streaks of gold and gray as the sun began its slow descent. The events of the past days were behind her now, but their echoes remained, lingering in the space between her breaths. Monica reflected on everything that had brought her here, from the frantic call in her Boston office to the moment she'd stood on that quiet, foggy road, staring into the faces of two officers who hadn't seen her for who she truly was. Those moments, ones of disbelief, tension, and fear, were burned into her memory. But they were no longer the ones she carried most heavily. What lingered instead were the small flickers of change she had witnessed in Springdale. A grieving father choosing to lead his community toward accountability. A hesitant officer stepping out of his silence to tell the truth. Strangers rallying in the streets, lifting signs with messages of justice and hope. For the first time in a long time, Monica believed that even in the face of deep-rooted injustice, people could rise. She turned onto a familiar stretch of highway, the Boston skyline still hidden in the distance. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced over and saw an unfamiliar number. Curiosity tugged at her, and she pressed the button to answer through the car's speaker. Hello? Dr. Tyler, this is Ethan Thompson. Monica blinked in surprise, a faint smile touching her lips. Ethan, it's good to hear from you. How did you get my number? Chief Harris, Ethan replied, his voice warm. I hope you don't mind. Not at all, she said, genuinely glad to hear his voice. There was a brief pause before Ethan spoke again, more thoughtfully this time. I just wanted to thank you for everything you did back there. Monica shook her head, her hands steady on the wheel. I don't think I did as much as you think. You did more than you know, Ethan said. I watched it happen. You came into Springdale and stood your ground, not just for yourself, but for all of us. That takes courage. Monica was quiet for a moment. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel like courage, she admitted. It just feels necessary. Ethan chuckled softly. That may be, but it still matters. Monica smiled faintly, the warmth in his words cutting through the weariness in her chest. How's Chief Harris? He's holding up, Ethan replied. He's already moving forward with changes at the department. Some folks are fighting back, of course, but others are standing with him. It's slow, but it's something. Good, Monica said softly. That's good to hear. And the town Springdale's starting to feel different, Ethan continued. People are talking, questioning things they never used to question. It's uncomfortable for some, but others are starting to see what they've been blind to. Monica nodded, even though he couldn't see her. That's how change begins. You should know, Ethan said after a moment, his voice sincere, that Lily's story, your story, has made a difference here. People won't forget it. Monica felt her throat tighten at his words. Thank you, Ethan. That means a lot. Take care of yourself, Dr. Tyler, Ethan said warmly. I hope our paths cross again someday. Me too, Monica replied. Take care, Ethan. The call ended, leaving the quiet hum of the engine to fill the space once more. Monica exhaled slowly, her thoughts turning to Springdale and everything it had shown her: pain, resistance, and the faint glow of progress. In Springdale, Chief Robert Harris stood on the steps of the police department, staring out at the crowd gathered in the town square. The sun had set now, the streetlights casting pools of golden light over the pavement. The crowd was smaller than before, but it was growing each day. Some people held candles, their soft flames flickering in the cold night air. Others held signs with Lily's name written in bold letters, alongside words like justice and change. Harris swallowed hard as he looked out at them, his daughter's face flashing in his mind. Her smile, her laugh, the way she used to throw her arms around him after school. She was gone, but her memory had sparked something that could not be ignored. He stepped up to the microphone, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. Springdale is my home, he began, his words slow and deliberate. It's the place where I raised my daughter, where I built my life, and where I swore to protect and serve everyone who lives here. The crowd quieted, listening. I failed my daughter, Harris continued, his voice thick with emotion. But I will not fail her memory. I will not allow what happened to Dr. Monica Tyler to be forgotten or excused. It's time we look hard at ourselves and the way we treat each other, at the assumptions we make and the harm they cause. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others staring quietly. Change isn't easy, Harris said, his voice growing stronger. It takes courage. It takes uncomfortable conversations. It takes accountability. And it takes all of us standing together, refusing to let injustice slip by unnoticed. He paused, scanning the crowd, his gaze steady. Lily's death will not be in vain. This is just the beginning, Springdale. We can be better, and we will be better. The crowd broke into applause, some cheering, others simply clapping with solemn determination. Harris stepped back from the microphone, his heart heavy but steady. For the first time in days, he felt like he was moving towards something meaningful, a road he could walk in Lily's honor. A week later, back in Boston, Monica Tyler sat in her office, the city's familiar sounds drifting through the window. Her desk was covered with patient files, emails, and reminders for upcoming surgeries. It was a busy day, just like any other, but as Monica leaned back in her chair, she felt different. Her laptop chimed with a new message, and she opened it to find an email from Chief Harris. It was short and to the point. Dr. Tyler, the officer's suspensions are now official. Newton has been reassigned and given a chance to prove himself. Fisher will never wear this badge again. I thought you'd want to know. Thank you for everything. Robert Harris. Monica let out a slow breath, her lips curving into a faint smile. She closed the email and sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. Lily's story had sparked change. Not all at once, not perfectly, but it was a start. Monica stood and turned to the window, looking out at the skyline bathed in soft afternoon light. For so long, she had carried the burden of proving herself, of standing alone against barriers that others didn't see. But Springdale had reminded her of something important. Change happens when people stand together. There would always be darkness in the world, but there would also be light, unexpected kindness, unshakable resilience, and the courage to fight for something better. Monica smiled softly as she whispered the words her father had told her long ago. Even in the darkest places, there's always someone willing to light the way. She turned back to her desk, ready to face the work ahead, her heart a little lighter than before. Thank you for following this powerful and emotional journey. Dr. Monica Tyler's story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, acts of kindness, courage, and truth can bring about change. It takes resilience to stand up for what's right, and it's the small steps we take that light the way for a better future. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories that inspire hope, empathy, and reflection. Together, we can keep spreading messages of perseverance, kindness, and change. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next story. Don't forget to subscribe and stay connected. Until next time.